Interesting, and we're set to have a conversation in relation to Martyrs Trade, and that story highlights some of the issues around, the Chinese investors coming to Kenya and undercutting business people. Now get this, according to the Henley Private Wealth Migration Report 2023, which tracks wealth and investment migration trends worldwide, some $100 millionaires fled Kenya last year, and a further 100 are projected to leave this year. This fleeing by the super rich to other countries is attributed to various issues: political instability, higher taxation, and weak economic growth. We're set to have a conversation around what exactly this portends for Kenya's economy. Joining me is Dr. Daniel Achach, who's an international trade lawyer. Daktari, karibu sana, or should I call you wakili? Both apply.
Both apply. Thank you very much
to the show. And I'd like your comment. I know Wakili Kibe Mungai added his voice to some of the push and pull we've witnessed between foreign traders and local traders, where they mention the foreign traders are undercutting them in terms of having fairer prices, and at the consumer at the end of the day will go where it suits his pocket. So in terms of international trade and Kenya's trade policy, where do you sit on the fence when it comes to this?
Thank you very much for having me today. Good afternoon, viewers. For me, it's a question of policy.
Yeah.
It's a question of national policy. The question we must ask ourselves as Kenyans is, why are the Chinese products cheaper when they come into Kenya? So, normally what happens is that you see countries have bilateral negotiations. Kenya has a bilateral arrangement with China in terms of how their goods enter into Kenya. And those negotiations normally involve reduction or sometimes even elimination of duties at the border. So that when you eliminate duty on a particular product at the border, the net effect then would be that when it comes into the country, it's cheaper than it would be when that duty is applied. And so most of the Kenyans do not really understand what the government does when they're negotiating with these countries. So the effect of those negotiations sometimes is that the prices then come down, and then the effect is felt by our local traders. So for me, the question is, which products are we talking about in the first place? Do we have local industries that produce similar products that compete with those ones? And then what does the government do? What is the government's policy in supporting then the local producers to be able to compete with the products that are coming in from China? So it's a question of government policy. Most of the times you realize that government, especially our government, negotiates bilateral arrangements with other countries, but then we do not put in policies in place to then cushion our own people, our own traders. And so then the effect is that you give advantage to the foreigners, and then our people complain. It's actually what that story depicts.
Okay, so it's down to the government policy in terms of trade and whatnot.
Yes.
So Kenya is open for business, but we definitely have to look into the fine print when it comes to certain issues. So we were just talking about matters to do with the super rich fleeing Kenya, and opening up this conversation, this means investors are fleeing Kenya. According to that report, 100 of them fled in 2022. They project 100 more in 2023. And this coming at a time where Kenya is definitely facing economic shocks here and there. So let's speak about some of these causative factors. And one of them happens to be, political instability. Just last year, we had the election. And of course, this gives jitters to investors when they see the emotive that is behind our elections right here. Paint us a picture. Ideally, how should elections be conducted in such a way that investors do not get flight or fright mode,
Unfortunately for us, it's become like a routine that after every general election, we then have a period of political instability where we have demonstrations. We have shops and industries locked down, and people not working. At the end of the day, when you're talking of putting up policies in a country that would attract investment from foreign investors, then political instability is very key. Actually, if you look at statistics in the continent, One of the reasons why even within Africa, Africa does not trade with itself like one African country with another African country is the question of political instability. Because then investment, business requires certainty. I want to be sure that if I put my money in Kenya, I come and put up my industry in Kenya, then tomorrow the industry will be opened and I'll be able to trade and I'll be able to get returns on my investments.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, the manner in which we conduct our politics in this country, especially when it relates to general elections, is such that we have a situation where it's a system of winner takes all, and so nobody accepts to have lost, and so the losers would then bring in this sort of thing. If you look at the statistics among the foreign direct investment in Kenya,
yeah,
it shows that if you look at the trend, a lot of flight of especially in the manufacturing sector, happens the year that follows a general election. And this shows you clearly that political instability in a country when it comes to attraction of foreign investment is very key. Is a key policy that the government must work on.
Okay, and we'll definitely come to the benefits of having investors coming to your country. Yet another causative factor has been highlighted as increased taxation. And this is coming at a point where Kenya is on board the economic conversation, all to do with the finance bill that is now a law, So let's talk about how increased taxation affects certain investors and why it's causing investors to flee the Kenyan market.
Yeah, it is said that Kenya is one of the highest taxed countries in the continent, and it's very sad when you look at it in the context of investment. And again, I'll use an example of the manufacturing sector to explain to you this. You see, taxation, when you add a tax on a product, the net effect of that taxation is to increase the cost of production. You see, when countries enter into arrangements like, let me use the East African Community as an example. The effect of the East African Community is a customs union, which basically means products within the community move freely, duty-free, quota-free, freely. Of course, there are a few exceptions. So then the effect of adding even a 1% tax on a manufacturer in Kenya means the cost of production of that manufacturer is higher than the competitor in Tanzania, who does not face that similar taxation. And if you talk to most manufacturers in Kenya today, they'll tell you that it's cheaper for them to go and put up in Tanzania and supply Kenya than put up in Kenya and supply because of the increased taxation. The problem we have is that we are looking at taxation that the government we have in place today has told us that we are moving away from taking the international loans. We now want to raise money domestically. The effect of raising money domestically is that you're raising taxes on the products. Some of these products that we tax are intermediary products that are used for production.
Yeah.
Some of the costs, like now we are saying, we are talking about the housing levy that has been introduced. We told you contribute 1.5%. Your employer, meets you the same 1.5%.
Yeah.
That 1.5% is an additional cost on production.
Okay.
And so if I'm the investor and I'm putting up my investment in this country and then have additional costs, what it means is that the product coming from Tanzania, which does not face that particular tax, will sell cheaper than my product. And so at the end of the day, I'll be driven out of the market. And so what option is left to me as an investor is to get, a cheaper place to produce.
But you see, it's such an intricate balance because at one end, the government needs taxes in order to finance its budget. Na tumeambiwa mara mingi kulipa ushuru ni kujitegemea, On the other end, you've mentioned that this increase is an increased cost to the investors who will look for cheaper options in other countries. So how do we strike a balance in terms of our tax policy? Because As I was doing our research, we were told that capital tax raised from 5 to 15% will negatively affect some of these foreign investors. So how do we strike a balance in our tax policy? So as much as we are, funding our own from within, we do not chase investors away.
Again, it will take me back to government policy. For me, this is what we need to do.
Yeah.
We need to raise money. Yeah, we need to raise money through taxation. The government needs to meet its obligations to the citizenry, which requires this money. But then we also need to cushion our, investors, so that in a way you do not use the taxation then to chase them away, so to speak.
Yeah.
For me, there are factors. You see, for instance, one of the problems in our manufacturing sector in this country is the question of energy cost. We have very high energy cost. In fact, I think we are the second or the third highest in the continent. So for me, if I were the government and I have to tax, I would tax, say, I'm introducing this 1.5% housing levy. Because I know the impact that this 1.5% would then cause, and I also want to attract investment at the same time, then I cushion my producers when it comes to energy. Introduce something like, a subsidy on the energy sector. And there are so many countries that have done this. If you look at the way Egypt handles the question of, attracting investors, there's a huge subsidy that is given to investors when it comes to the cost of energy, when it comes to things like transportation. So there's a way the government can play around with the policy so that it still gets the tax at the end of the day, but cushions the producers against this.
You know how subsidy is an emotive topic right now. So if we did that, would that be subsidizing production or consumption? Just briefly.
So when you see this, sometimes it is looked at as an egg and chick kind of thing.
Which came first, yeah.
But for me, you see, when you cushion an industry, that industry is able then to absorb people in terms of employment. And when these people are employed, at the end of the day, they pay taxes to the government. And so at the end of the day, it's a win-win situation for the government. Let me give you an example of the cement sector in this country. Most cement companies in Kenya are struggling right now. Yet, we are doing very big infrastructural projects in this country. We are building roads, we are building railways, and you ask yourself why. The reason is because these roads or railways that we are building, the contracts are given to the Chinese who are importing cement from China. So if the government came up with a policy and said, we want cement to be from Kenya. I saw you covered a story that was talking on local content. Cement must be from Kenya. Chinese tells us our cement is not good enough. We tell them, we want to cushion you. We want to give you a subsidy. We'll give you free land. We'll give you tax holidays. Come and put up your company in Kenya and produce that good cement from here.
While here, yeah.
We'll have employment, we'll have technology transfer, and at the end of the day, it will not be a loss in subsidy, it will be a win for the government.
Okay, so there's a net effect.
Yes.
I definitely get where you're coming from. Let's shift to the other causative factor, and this is touching on a weak shilling. How exactly will a weak shilling chase away investors from the country? Because according to statistics, the value of the shilling has dropped by about 9% during the year 2022.
Yeah, again, the question of exchange rates, it's a big concern. For investors, of course, when the shilling drops, it means the dollar has gained against the shilling, and so your investment shrinks when the shilling loses value to the dollar. And so that's on the surface of it. If you look at the region, just a few years ago, 5-6 years ago, the Tanzanian shilling was exchanging to about 24, 23 to the Kenyan shilling. Today, it is at 16, 17. So clearly, there's a problem. But when it comes to the question of investment and the shilling losing value to the dollar, for me, you see, a weak shilling for a country that is a net importer makes it very expensive. So the government again has to come in by way of policy. Countries like China deliberately devalued their currencies because China came up with a policy to promote their domestic industries to produce for export. And the moment you now have a country as a net exporter, then a weaker currency becomes an advantage to that country.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, in this country, the situation we are facing is that we are importing more than we are exporting. We've just said that there's not much cushion to our producers, our investors are fleeing, which means our capacity to export is actually going down.
Okay.
And now coming with it, we are also losing the value in the shilling. So all these factors then come up to, does not create very conducive environment for an investor, for a foreign investment. If you are to come to put up say a manufacturing company, manufacturing, for instance, something like paper in this country.
Yeah.
And then this paper, you expect to then export it to the neighboring Uganda or Tanzania. So when then the shilling loses value to the dollar, and where you're exporting it, the currency does not lose value. I mean, it's the Tanzanian shilling is stronger to the dollar.
Yeah.
At the end of the day, for an investor, you ask yourself, which one is easier for me? Should I stay in Kenya and fight against the weak shilling, or should I move and look for another place where it is better for me? At the end of the day, as an investor, I want return on my investments. And so government policy, the investor will not force the government to change its policy. The investor will look for a place where the policy is conducive for investment.
Okay.
So at the end of the day, the onus is on us as a country.
So what exactly do we need to change in terms of our policy? So we change this narrative that this report is saying 100 are expected to leave in 2023. If we were to change this narrative, what would you recommend that we do?
Unfortunately, international trade policy sometimes runs parallel to political decisions. In this sense, it's not that I believe today we have some of the most brilliant minds in this country at the helm of our leadership. I mean, our president is a brilliant fellow, well educated, and most of the ministers and people in leadership. Sometimes decisions are made to suit political circumstances. And unfortunately, some of those decisions, in fact, most of them may not really be sound when you look at them from through economic lenses. For me, I think the government needs to do a number of things to cushion investors in this country.
Okay.
Number one, I think the government needs to address the issue of high cost of energy in this country. Number two, the government needs to work around the question of instability, especially political instability. We need to find a meeting point between the opposition and those in government so that we bring to a stop this issue of demonstrations every day, and we allow the private sector to work properly. Thirdly, the government, there's also another problem that affects investment in this country. When we came up with devolution, we created county governments. And today what happens is that you put up an industry, and then if your industry operates across more than one county, then you have parallel charges, you have parallel procedures, you have a lot of these things. So again, in terms of regulatory framework that we have in this country, the government needs to work on the industrial policy and regulatory framework that would then be conducive in terms of attracting investment in this country.
Okay, so concerted effort with that goal in mind. Asante sana Daktari Wakili for